the Russians absolutely have a major strategic objective that they have been working towards this year. And it's actually, there's a consistent through line through all of Russia's operations and tactics over the past 3 years, but it's very salient now. And the key Russian strategic objective is convince the West, convince the United States in particular, that the war in Ukraine cannot be won, that Russian battlefield victory, although slow, is inevitable, and that therefore the prudent thing is to negotiate now, cut your losses, and just skip ahead to, the end chapter of where this novella inevitably has to be. And what that really is it's a Russian informational objective to secure the territorial concessions that Russia is physically incapable of actually achieving on the battlefield, at least not within years.
This is a conversation with George Barros from the Institute of Study of War, where he leads the team that has been monitoring and reporting on the war in Ukraine every day for the past 3.5 years. I personally freely admit that I did not expect this war to go on for nearly as long as it has. And so we talk with George about how long he realistically thinks that it can keep going. When does George expect it to end? And what is the most likely scenario in which it could happen? We talk about what reaching 1 million casualties actually means for Russia. How sustainable is it for it to keep this rate of losses? What are the main pressures on its war effort? What is likely to break first? Or why he believes that the narrative of Russia's infinite manpower pool is a myth? Or how sustainable all this is for Ukraine, and whether Ukraine can afford to keep fighting this way for years to come. If you want to get more geopolitical analysis to help you filter all the noise from the stuff that actually matters, you can sign up to my newsletter, where I break down big picture geopolitical stories, trends, and patterns. You can find the link in the description. And as a reminder, the corporate partner of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. And now, enjoy the conversation. All right, so welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Dominic. Good to see you once again.
So you're the perfect person to talk to about where the war is in Ukraine and where the war is going. But I think I do have a lot of quite detailed questions, but it does seem that in the recent months, the war, apart from things like Operation Spiderweb, has sort of disappeared from the mainstream news. And the general updates about the war, if we're receiving any, it's in much lower frequency and a lower quantity. So I think it would maybe make sense to start with an overview of what has been going on the front line, and what has been the situation on the front line and in the war in general in recent weeks and months.
Yeah, absolutely. So the war in Ukraine still exists. I think most spectators in the mainstream media, there's sort of a one war at a time, sort of audience or entity. So obviously the spectacular events in the Middle East have been taking the full attention, but the war in Ukraine is still going on, and it's still very intense. We are in the midst of Russia's summer offensive campaign season right now, which began around late May or so. The Russians are trying to make gains across the theater. They're prioritizing, in our assessment, eastern Ukraine, specifically the city of Konstantinivka. The Russians, that is the main effort in our assessment. They've redeployed some divisions that were previously operating near Pokrovsk, which we recall was the Russians' main objective to seize in fall of 2024. That effort failed, at least for now. They've deprioritized Pokrovsk. They are now trying to seize Konstantinivka. They're close to seizing all of Terezk if they haven't done so already. They're close to seizing all of Chasiv Yar if they haven't already done so already. And that's that. There's also a secondary Russian offensive supporting effort that is underway in northern Ukraine, in Sumy Oblast. As we recall, the Russians all but expelled Ukraine from all of Kursk Oblast in spring 2025. That has since snowballed into a Russian counteroffensive in Kursk, but now a Russian offensive into Sumy. And so the Russians have made some tactical gains in Sumy. They've seized a number of villages and fields, and they're approaching, getting closer to be within about 25 kilometers of Sumy city. That's tube artillery range for the Russians to be able to hit Sumy city. But that effort in recent weeks has been slowing down. The tempo has decreased. The Russians have reportedly started to deprioritize that effort. And it's our assessment that the Russians currently don't have the combat power in the vicinity. They have about 60,000 troops or so in that area, which would be insufficient for seizing Sumy City. We also see the Russians trying to make some moves in southwestern part of, the southeastern part of the theater, near the seam between Donetsk and, Dnipropetrovsk oblasts. So in recent weeks, there was some major, titillating news about how the Russians began a major new offensive operation in Dnipropetrovsk Oblast. It's a very nuanced discussion we can have there, but essentially Russian forces that were operating in the border area between Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk Oblast, they walked in and they made some small tactical gains. But this is really just a continuation of the long ongoing Russian offensive operations in Donetsk that are designed to seize Pokrovsk. Dmitry Medvedev and the Russian MOD notably made a big PR move, and they decided to grandiosely proclaim that they'd begun a new offensive in an entirely new oblast, one which the Kremlin notably has not officially declared annexed, unlike Donetsk. But in our assessment, the Institute's assessment, this is just a continuation of the local battlefield fighting that's designed to snake around into the Ukrainians' rear, to interdict the supply lines. It's not as if there's a new major operational undertaking that's designed to take large swaths of Dnipropetrovsk, at least at this time. So, that's another interesting thing that's been happening, as well. But generally speaking, the lines are relatively stable. The Russians continue to make small creeping tactical gains across the theater. There is minimal risk of any sort of major operational breakthrough on the Russians' behalf. The Ukrainian defense, particularly with drones, has really matured, and it's amazing what the Ukrainians can do despite their manpower shortages, and how well they're actually able to hold the line with a very large number of drones and a very small number of actually infantry holding down frontline fighting positions. And the Russian attrition rate, because of those tactics, remain very, very high. And it brings into discussion and into question a whole bunch of things, like to what extent is the Russian offensive actually sustainable? To what extent is Ukraine's defense sustainable? And what are the prospects for Russia's summer offensive? So that's sort of where we are right now in a nutshell.
Well, that's exactly what I want to talk about, and I think it was a great tactical, operational overview of what's going on. But let's maybe try to contextualize it a little bit and look at how important those tactical developments that you were talking about actually are. How important is it for both Russians and Ukrainians, and how big of a deal would it be, for example, if Russia does take places like Pokrovsk or Chasiv Yar that they've been trying to take for quite a long time? To what extent, to maybe for external observers to better understand it, to what extent any of that would be a game changer? So, some of these things are more important than others. We'll start in order of severity. The loss of Pokrovsk would be operationally significant. Pokrovsk is an important logistical hub and node. If you study the terrain, you study the geography, and you study, where the highways are, where the railroads are, there's a very important railroad station that leads, into Pokrovsk. And Pokrovsk is therefore important for supporting the surrounding Ukrainian tactical positions in terms of supply and sustainment. And so the Russian seizure of Pokrovsk, it wouldn't be game ending. It wouldn't be a strategic loss, but it would be an operational setback because it would make consequently the defense of the other tactical positions around Pokrovsk much more difficult. And it would likely accelerate Russian tactical gains in this theater and the sector. So that would be bad. It would be very bad, but not catastrophic, I would say. Now the good news is that it appears that the Ukrainians have stuffed the Russians on Pokrovsk for the time being. There was a very long campaign to try to seize Pokrovsk for the majority of the later half of 2024. The Russians seemingly have deprioritized that for now. They've stopped trying to impale themselves with direct frontal assaults onto Pokrovsk. And then again, early this year in 2025, the Russians redeployed 2 divisions of the 8th Combined Arms Army, the 20th Motorized Rifle Division and the 150th Motorized Rifle Division, which were previously,
charging against Pokrovsk, they were redeployed towards Toretsk, closer to the Konstantinivka direction, which was a very strong indicator of Russian intent for the summer offensive season. So Pokrovsk for now seems safe. That is not to say Pokrovsk will not always be safe. The Russians have created this big salient that bulges to the south of Pokrovsk, and it's possible if they can expand it further to the west, they then might be able to try to do this gradual, slow creeping envelopment of Pokrovsk with time. But it appears that Pokrovsk will be safe for the summer. Now, Chasiv Yar. The Russians have been fighting in Chasiv Yar since 2023. Chasiv Yar is really one of the first settlements right after Bakhmut, and after the Wagner Group seized Bakhmut back in 2023, they immediately began offensive operations to the west, and they've been stuck in Chasiv Yar since then. Not just the Wagner Group, but other Russian units as well, like the 98th Airborne Division, have been stuck in Chasiv Yar for well over 2 years at this point, if I recall correctly. And the town is basically all but completely destroyed. If you look at it in combat footage, it's basically all just ruin and rubble. And the Ukrainians have done a really excellent job of tying down Russian combat power for that village, and really making them fight street by street, block by block. The Russians are very close to technically seizing all of what was formerly the town of Chasiv Yar. They paid a tremendous price for it, and there's not a whole lot that it gives them at this point, other than they're a little bit closer to being able to get closer to Konstantinivka. The next, it's operationally significant town, and I would call Konstantinivka an operationally significant town, not Chasiv Yar. It allows them to be able to get troops into there, and then the Russians would hope to be able to resume their tactics of essentially storming a city, working their way into the urban environs, and then slowly, methodically, through high casualties, trying to seize these towns. So the loss of Chasiv Yar, I see more or less as an inevitability, given the time, and the process. But it was a very, very good trade, and it's not over yet. And, it's our assessment that the Russian objective is to try to seize Konstantinivka this year. I would be very surprised if the Russians manage to seize Konstantinivka this year. I expect the summer campaign will peter out with the Russians on the outskirts of Konstantinivka, or perhaps in an optimistic world for the Russian perspective, maybe somewhere in the urban environs of Konstantinivka, but certainly not seizing the whole city. When we look at Russian combat operations in urban environments, they're typically long, slow, protracted processes where the Russians truly fight like a whole campaign to seize a city. The Battle of Bakhmut took very many months. The Battle of Mariupol took very many months. I expect the battle for Konstantinivka, assuming they even get that far, would also take several months too.
To maybe take a step back, do you think that Russia, for this ongoing summer offensive, has any actual strategic goals other than just to push forward a little bit once again? Do you think that there's any goal of how to actually turn the war around or achieve any strategically significant achievement? Or is it just, keep pushing? This is another attempt, and the farther we get, the better, but we don't really expect to achieve anything significant.
So I love this question because the answer is decisively yes. The Russians absolutely have a major strategic objective that they have been working towards this year. And it's actually, there's a consistent through line through all of Russia's operations and tactics over the past 3 years. But it's very salient now. And the key Russian strategic objective, it's not a battlefield tactical kinetic objective. It is the political, informational, strategic decision-making shaping objective, which is the Russians right now are firing on all cylinders and even using and designing their operations on the ground to achieve this objective. And the objective is convince the West, convince the United States in particular, that the war in Ukraine cannot be won, that Russian battlefield victory, although slow, is inevitable, and that therefore the prudent thing is to negotiate now, cut your losses, and just skip ahead to, the end chapter of where this novella inevitably has to be. And that's that. And what that really is it's a Russian informational objective to secure the territorial concessions that Russia is physically incapable of actually achieving on the battlefield, at least not within years. And so when we see the Russians position themselves and make threats against the West, when they threaten Ukraine with using Oreshnik missiles or nuclear weapons, or reviving the dirty bomb narrative like they did a few weeks ago, or claiming that falsely that Russia's economy is much stronger and more robust than it really is, or putting forward the notion that Russia can tank, endless casualties forever. This is a giant game of smoke and mirrors. The fact of the matter is that the Russian capability to protract and sustain this war, especially indefinitely, is really questioned and suspect. The Russians have a much weaker hand than obviously the resources of the collective West backing Ukraine does. Putin has made several mistakes in how to finance and sustain a protracted war that present opportunities for us to exploit. And so Putin really wants to convince us, this is the strategic through line, that he wants us to basically internalize the Russian premise that Russian victory is inevitable, Ukrainian defeat is inevitable, and therefore let's just stop supporting Ukraine, because then that victory will become inevitable. But I will argue that it's not inevitable, and that is actually the decisive, Clausewitz would call that the center of gravity for this war. And it's our assessment that the Russians, they conduct their campaigns on the battlefield in such a way to further that narrative. And some of the attacks that we see, we think are designed to actually push forward the Russian front line on the map to further bolster this narrative, rather than because it was tactically intelligent or operationally sound for Russian forces to go and seize that terrain. But for the human brain to look at a map and see a line move, that's probably the simplest and most intuitive way to think about a war, but it's not a perfect indicator. And so we can talk more about this objective, but that's the overarching Russian objective. And by the way, that's also what the Russians were trying to do with the first half of this year with all of these bilateral meetings with Americans in Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, and all that stuff, which ended up being a tremendous waste of American time.
Do you think that this psychological objective or this attempt to achieve it is working? Because from my perspective, I would probably be quite skeptical. I can't speak for the Ukrainians, but in Europe and probably in the US, I don't really seem a haste to end the war unnecessarily as soon as possible that Russia is trying to create.
So, I think it has different effects on different audiences. It certainly works with Orban. It can work with Fico. I think it's found fertile ground with the current administration in the United States, and that's really all you really need. If you can convince the United States to call it quits, then the Russians will have a much easier time with the conquest of Ukraine. Europe on the whole is much more clear-eyed, and I think a part of that is, part of its geography. When you're closer to the problem, when you're closer to the threat, you have a better strategic clarity about the problem. But look, the administration that we currently have, they've made policy mistakes vis-a-vis Ukraine. They've been too accommodating, I think, of the Russian presuppositions. When Marco Rubio goes out there and says that there is a military solution to the war, most wars actually do in fact have military solutions. This one I don't think is much different. It's just a question of on what terms. The Russians seek to use a military solution to impose their will, and they're not going to stop unless we stop that. So I do think it has been effective to a certain extent. Now the key thing is we have to use facts and evidence to try to make the case and be persuasive that actually, no, the Russians do have vulnerabilities, and we should try to exploit them. We should try to support the Ukrainians. It's not exactly clear that the Russians are, this endless wellspring of manpower and resources magically for some reason. But there are people that think that, for sure.
Just a quick break here to let you know that the corporate sponsor of this podcast is Conductor, which provides software for crisis exercises for everything from cyber threats and supply chain security to hybrid warfare. Thank you, Conductor, for sponsoring this podcast. And now, back to the conversation. Well, I think maybe on that note, I think at least some people have probably noticed that in recent weeks, the Russian casualties, according to Ukrainian sources, which are probably quite legitimate from what I've heard, the Russian casualties of both killed and wounded together have crossed over 1 million people, which is a pretty significant number any way you look at it. But in terms of actually being able to continue and sustain the war, how do you think that this is more of a symbolic number, or what does it actually mean for Russian future prospects of how long it can keep it going in terms of manpower and personnel regeneration?
Two-part answer. Number one, the round, big, beautiful number of 1 million is symbolic, and the media's grasp onto it, and it's a number that our primate minds like because it's big and round and whole. So that's basically just, it's a number. It's a very big number, but it's just a number. Now, part two, the Russians are in it, I think, a problem when it comes to their fourth generation apparatus and their strategy for fourth generation, because I will argue through trying to analyze the Russian fourth generation strategy that it is not sustainable in the mid to long term, and that Putin will have to make some difficult decisions about where to find men moving forward, because the system is really quite brittle, and Putin has made some very bad resourcing mistakes on how to actually find the men, and we can elaborate and get into that. So that is to say, the figure of 1 million casualties, that's a staggering eye-watering number. It is to a certain extent just a number, however, but at the same time, there are legitimate crises, or maybe not crises, but there are legitimate problems for the Russian fourth generation effort, and the Russian government is going to have to make some difficult decisions in the future about how to go forward with this.
So let's elaborate on that. Which mistakes do you have in mind?
So, I'm going to ask you to humor me in going into a little bit of a history lesson, because it requires a little bit of context. And I think perhaps your listeners who have not been following the war, very closely, or who are not familiar with Russia's fourth generation strategy might appreciate this nuance and context. But look, Putin, in our assessment, made a massive strategic mistake in the early phases, like first weeks and months of the war in early 2022, when he decided how to go about resourcing and generating forces for a protracted war. As we know, Putin did not plan for a protracted war. His special military operation was only supposed to be a few weeks or months, if that. He did not plan for a 3-year war or a 4-year war or a 5-year war. Putin made decisions on how to generate forces. What Putin really should have done, and this would have been a sound decision from a military and economic standpoint, would be to follow in the footsteps of previous Russian leaders when it comes to wartime resourcing. In Tsarist Russia, you had conscript slaves who the Tsar could essentially just deploy in a basically close to endless amount of serfs to go fight. And they would be, compensated very, very meagerly. It was essentially free labor. The Red Army in World War II, of course, did the same thing, where millions of Russians, and not just Russians, Soviet citizens, were sent to go fight. And basically, these were massive conscript slave armies. Vladimir Putin is a politically smart guy, and he's a politically actually very risk-averse person. And he understands that Tsarist white army conscription was very unpopular. It's part of the reason why the peasants uprose against the Tsarist regime. Vladimir Putin is a student of history and understands the role that the the mother's civil societies that arose as a result of the Afghan war in the late 80s played a catalytic role in bringing about the end of the Soviet Union. So Putin understands that when you use the monopoly of violence of the Russian state to coerce many Russian men to go die when they have no say, that is politically that's a political, hot potato you're playing with in Russian society. And so what Putin did is he established an alternative social contract, which is, I don't use the Russian monopoly of violence of the state to coerce hundreds of thousands or millions of men to go fight in Ukraine. I pay you. And so what Putin does is, really mobilization is not the right word. What it really is it's large scale payoffs and blood money and bribery. The Russians amended their federal law on military service, and they introduced a new class of servicemen called volunteer. And the vast majority of Russian soldiers that are fighting in Ukraine are, they're either contract soldiers who sign up to know what they're doing, or they're this new class called volunteers, dobrovolцы in Russian. And when you sign up to become a volunteer, you get paid a lot of money. You get paid, firstly, your regular, annual or monthly salary. You get paid a one-time sign-up bonus, both from the federal budget, but also from the provincial, local, oblast level government that you sign up in. And each of the oblasts provide different compensation packages. And then if you're killed or wounded, then you're entitled to a whole bunch of other state benefits as well. And so, by the time that you actually calculate the compensation package for a Russian volunteer soldier, it ends up to be quite a large sum of money. Currently, right now, it's around $35,000, about one-time sign-up bonus just to go sign up and show up, let alone what you're going to get paid on a monthly basis. That's a huge amount of money for the Russians. And when you look at the casualty rates per day, per month, the Russians lose about 1,000 people plus per day, killed and wounded. It's about 30 to 45,000 killed or wounded per month, which the Russians are able to regroup and regenerate. But when you do the math for how much that actually costs, it's a very quick way to introduce a lot of externalities into your economy, which are going to really bugger up your economy. And so this system, this strategy absolutely can work if you're fighting a several-month war. Perhaps it could even work if you're only going to fight a 1-year war. But if you're going to fight a 2-year war or a 3-year war or a 4-year war, it becomes increasingly difficult. And the reasons why are because the number of people that are willing to actually take the money decrease over time. And so what you have to do is to go after a dwindling supply, you have to increase the incentives, basically change the demand curve. And so the Russians have had to actually over time inflate the compensation packages, especially in the form of the one-time sign-up bonuses, which you can do. If you look historically, when the Russians first introducing these one-time sign-up bonuses, they were much more modest. They were, in the neighborhood of just a couple $1,000s here or there. But now, the going rate is like $35,000. Last summer, we reached a peak of $40,000 that was offered by Samara Oblast. It was somewhere around 4 million rubles. They've since had to tamp it down because it was just way too high. But that's a problem. Other issues arise as well. You introduce a very loose fiscal policy. So that means that, you are going to put a lot of cash into the Russian economy, which is going to spike up inflation quite a bit. And inflation is currently a major problem in the Russian Federation. What it also does is, how are you going to finance it? It creates financing and budgetary constraints on the Russian government. So the Russian budget deficit is increasing year after year, and the Russians have been able to get away with it so far because they've been tapping into the liquidity portion of Russia's sovereign wealth fund. But some economists estimate that the Russian sovereign wealth fund, at least the liquidity portion of it, will be tapped by the end of this year, at which point it'll become more difficult to think about how to finance these things. It also causes problems vis-a-vis your monetary policy, because all of a sudden, when you have all this money moving around within the economy and inflation's up, then it forces the central bank to have a higher interest rate. And so the interest rate in the central banking system right now is about 20%. But that, of course, is a problem because it imposes very high costs on capital, which the Russians need to be freely available for the defense industry. Not to mention the effects that this also has on the labor market. When you're trying to find employment in Russia, every single civilian employer has to provide luxurious compensation packages per Russian standards to just compete against the Russian Ministry of Defense or defense industry. And so it greatly inflates what is considered to be a competitive salary just in the civilian market. But then, of course, when you're losing and having killed or seriously wounded 30 to 45,000 people per month, I mean, those are able-bodied men that can either serve in the military or work in the domestic economy, but can't do both at the same time. And so Russia also simultaneously has a labor shortage of about 1 million people right now, and which will only become more acute over time unless they're able to offset it with foreign laborers. But even then, foreign laborers aren't able to do the same sort of work as a, domestic Russian. So, this causes a lot of problems. And, for the Russian fourth generation picture, in the first quarter of this year, 2025, the Russians already burned through all of the money that they were supposed to have for recruitment for the entire fiscal year of 2025. And they got about 90,000 soldiers out of it, which is about 22% higher than what they got out of 2024. They only got about 72 something or so soldiers out of the first quarter for recruitment in 2024, but they're over budget. And so now the Russians are going to have to think about where are they going to get the additional funds to finance recruitment for the rest of this year. So the quarter two figures for this year will be very interesting to look at. Quarter three figures and quarter four figures will be very interesting to look at. But I'm prepared to make the argument and say that Putin's mistake to essentially do what his Soviet and white imperial predecessors did when it came to basically coercing many, many Russians to go fight and die for nothing, and instead now giving them these compensation packages, it is economically destroying Russia in a variety of ways. And it is not just, I make the case, I'm not prepared to tell you exactly when you're going to have a decisive breakdown of the system, because these things are exceedingly difficult to forecast. But if you look at the fundamentals, it's not healthy. The Russian economy is very unhealthy right now. And I would argue that so long as we can sustain the Russians in this system, something's going to have to give eventually. And I think the Russians are going to have to make very difficult decisions within the next 12 months.
What do you think is going to be the thing that's going to break? Because the way I look at it, it's that probably one of the four options will have to happen. That either they will run out of money to pay the increasingly high bonuses and salaries, or they will start to run into issues with recruiting enough people to regenerate the losses on the battlefield, or they will have to move towards more forced mobilization, or they will have to try to take the negotiation seriously and try to scale down or pause the war through some kind of a negotiated settlement. So which of these four things do you think is the most likely to happen?
So this is a really great question. I don't have a confident answer for you at this time, but I can maybe give you a ranking for where I think, which ones are more likely, which ones are least likely. I think what's least likely is that Putin goes to a negotiating table. Because I think Putin would rather eke it through. And most importantly, Putin's theory of victory is he can basically muddle through as long as he doesn't face decisive setbacks on the battlefield. And so he can control that in part by, as long as he keeps the United States from sending the Ukrainians more than the number of Abrams tanks we sent, which was 31 back in 2023. We've not sent a single one more. Then he doesn't have to risk any of those issues. Or as long as we don't send any more Bradleys and therefore incentivize more Ukrainians to, volunteer to go drive and pilot those Bradleys, then the Putin thinks he'll be able to go forward. So I think that's a very low likelihood, and because Putin's not incentivized at all to negotiate. Every time Putin doubles down, and the West basically doesn't meet him, and we accommodate his, the various assertions the Russians make, then that's a positive indicator for Putin. I think, again, towards the bottom of likelihood options, but still something that I would consider within the realm of possibility, is another round of mobilization. Putin seeks to avoid this at all costs possible, but he retains the option to do so. And I'm confident that if it's a question between having a dramatic Russian collapse of the line, the likes of which we saw in 2022 with the Kharkiv counteroffensive, Putin will conduct another round of mobilization to either mitigate that or prevent it. Now, that is not to say that it's not cost-free. When you pull 300,000 people, reservists, and bring them into the military, that, of course, comes at the expense of your domestic employment, because those were presumably workers in the domestic economy. So that's going to make your labor shortage more acute. And so I would argue that for the Westerners, we shouldn't say, well, if he'll just mobilize more people and therefore he'll be okay. It's like, no, he'll have to mobilize more people, which is going to cause problems with the labor market, which is going to further mess up the Russian economy, which is a good thing and will have its own effects in the longer run. And so I would seek to have to impose upon Putin the dilemma of having to make a decision on where do I find the 300 or 500,000 people I want to mobilize. So that would be a good thing. I mean, it'd be a bad thing in the moment for Ukraine, of course, but a very bad thing for the Russians in terms of strategy and maintaining a protracted war. Finding recruits, I think that's going to also be a not very likely problem. The Russians have done quite a lot to try to increase the recruitment pool. They've done a lot to, keep the people going, and they continue to surprise us month by month. They continue to keep finding the volunteers, including augmenting it with external forces, like pulling in, a division's worth of North Koreans, by recruiting some successfully and unsuccessfully foreign nationals, including Sri Lankans and Indians and Africans and all this stuff. So, I don't think they're going to necessarily have as much of an issue there. The issue that they're going to have, I think, is the financing. That's going to be the problem first and foremost. And that's going to be a perennial problem because Putin's going to, I see Putin already decreasing the incentives, making the eligibility requirements a little bit tighter, having to budget more aggressively to try to afford this. And it's, the budgeting issue is really where it's going to be a problem. And the Russians had previous well springs that they could use to tap into to finance this. I mean, the Sovereign Wealth Fund was one. The Russians were hoping for higher oil prices, but there were some higher oil prices as a result of the Middle East action that we saw over the last weeks. These are some of the things that the Russians need to finance, but are not coming through. The Brent oil prices did not spike as we all sort of anticipated. It went up from 60 to 65, but sort of stayed there, stable more or less. And so I think the finance is going to be the big issue. Now, break. The big assumption, however, that all of this thinking relies on is that the tempo of fighting and the Russian loss rate in Ukraine stays the same. This entire analysis is invalidated if the number of Russians killed or wounded per month goes below 30 to 45,000 casualties per month, because that is what the Ukrainians are abstracting, and that is the main driver of what is bringing about the economic destruction of Russia. If that slips down to, 25 to 30 or a lower number, either due to the fighting changing or reduction of Western aid to Ukraine or Ukrainian lethality decreasing for some reason, then the whole calculus changes. So my argument is that the continued military support to Ukraine to keep the Ukrainians as lethal as they can be, to continue extracting those casualties, to retain the requirement for Putin to generate these forces at the high price that he has locked himself into, that will push Russia slowly but surely in the direction of having to make these difficult choices. And I would characterize it as these will be difficult choices that Putin will have to grapple with, not one of these things will break in the house of cards and implodes.
Yeah, I think maybe on the issue of the financing problems that Russia has and will have, I agree that the issues are there, but I feel like that whenever I speak to people who are actually economists and who study, who focus on Russian economy in a lot of detail, I've had Yanis Kluge recently who focuses on the Russian economy as his main specialty. And I feel like that the takeaway there usually is that Russian economy is in trouble. It is in an increasing trouble and it will get worse. But still, despite that, if Putin wants to, he can keep funding the war even at this level for a pretty long time. He would just have to keep withdrawing more money from all the other areas of the economy and putting them into defense and the military. But if he really wanted to, he could keep doing this for, quite a long time, at least for several years.
I'm prepared to accept that, but then that means Putin has to renege on the social contract somewhere. So Russians are used to a certain kind of living standard in the post-Soviet time. I mean, Putin's whole social contract that he established with Russians and the rise of Putin in the 90s was terrible. If all this to be was terrible, you give me your freedoms and I will bring you stability and a better quality of life. Like that, and I will restore Russia's geopolitical preeminence on the global stage. That is essentially the Putin social contract. And so if he reneges on elements of that, that's when things can start to become quite difficult in Russia. The other things that I'd also say that are a risk in this system has to do with the various amount of debt that is circling around within Russian financial institutions. So there's a number of commercial banks in Russia and also government-owned banks that have a lot of debt, and the delinquency rates on the debt are going up. And so one of the things that I'm concerned about, or what Putin should be concerned about, is at what point do one of these major financial institutions default on its loans, and then that trigger a larger financial problems within the economy, because they can continue. You're right. They can continue to borrow and they can continue to redirect certain assets away from other things. But that introduces a lot of risk. And, I'm not prepared to say at what point in time it's not going to be viable, but when you have people defaulting on their mortgages and their loans and other things, which is happening at an increasing rate in Russia, that you run into the risk of that affecting, one of the major creditors.
I personally, when I'm thinking about the war and when I was thinking about it, over the past 3.5 years, I've always been trying to just personally guess how long it's going to keep going on, how long it's going to last, and when is it going to end. And I fully admit that in those personal estimates of mine, I've been always wrong. And I never thought that the war would go on as long as it has. And I thought that both sides would be a lot more exhausted and a lot earlier and a lot more motivated to seek a ceasefire. But at the same time, I would say that what I always thought applies, that it cannot go on forever. And actually, if you look at history, there's only been a very few wars of this intensity and scale that have lasted as long as this has. It doesn't usually go over 3, maybe 4 years. So it's already breaking records in some point. And I know that this is an extremely difficult and speculative question, but when you think about it personally, or maybe I would be interested to hear how you think about it personally, but how long do you realistically expect the war to go on? Do you have a date or a year in mind? And, as someone who's been monitoring it for every day for 3.5 years, how much longer do you think that realistically this could go on? And I know it's difficult to answer, but I imagine you must get asked it at some point in briefings, so you must have an answer for it. I'd be very curious to hear it. Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests.